Have you ever stopped to think about why, even though you're making more money than you were a few years ago, the feeling of financial tightness stays the same, or even gets worse? Why that long-awaited promotion that raise you thought would change everything, in practice, changed almost nothing about how you feel when it comes to money? What if I told you that this isn't a coincidence, it's not bad luck, and it's not your fault for not knowing how to better manage what you earn? What you're about to discover in this video is going to reveal something that very few people understand. There's an invisible psychological cycle, powerful, silent, and extremely effective, that keeps millions of people trapped in chronic financial anxiety, regardless of how much they make. We're going to talk about how fear has become the real controller of your financial decisions, how financial stress can be just as addictive as any other dependency, and most importantly, how this pattern is destroying your ability to make intelligent decisions without you even realizing it. Stay until the end, because what you're about to learn here might be exactly the missing key you need to finally break this cycle that seems to have no end. There's a truth about money that's rarely said clearly and directly, and that truth is this: your relationship with money has far more to do with what happens inside your head than with the number that shows up in your bank account. That might seem strange at first because we've been taught our whole lives that the financial problem is always a matter of quantity, not having enough, needing to earn more, owing too much. And of course, quantity matters. Nobody here is going to deny that. But what you've probably never stopped to carefully observe is that there's an enormous number of people who earn completely different salaries. Some earn 3, 4, 5 times more than others, and yet they live with the same level of financial anxiety, the same tightness in their chest when the credit card bill arrives, the same feeling that money is never enough, that something's always missing, that at any moment everything could collapse. Do you know someone like that? Someone who earns well, who should be financially comfortable, but who's always complaining about money, who's always at their limit, who never seems to be able to get out of that cycle of stress? Or maybe that person is you, and you're watching this video precisely because you recognize in yourself this pattern that doesn't make logical sense, but that emotionally makes all the sense in the world. So let's start at the beginning. Let's understand what's really happening here. Because when you can see the invisible mechanism that's operating behind the scenes in your mind, you finally gain the power to change it. Think with me for a moment. What do you feel when you think about money? Not what you think you should feel, not what would be rational or appropriate to feel, but what you genuinely feel, deep down, when the subject of money comes up in your life. For many people, the honest answer is anxiety, fear, worry, a weight in the pit of your stomach. And this happens not only when money is lacking, but also when there's a little extra, when it's balanced, when everything's relatively okay. It's as if the mind has learned to associate the topic of money with the emotion of threat, and that association has become so strong over time that it now operates automatically without needing a real reason to exist. And here's the first fundamental point I want you to understand. This association between money and fear is not natural. It's not inevitable. It's not something you were born with. It was learned. It was built. It was installed in your mind through experiences, through messages you received throughout your life, through patterns you observed in the people around you, especially in your childhood and adolescence. And if it was learned, it can be unlearned. But to unlearn it, you first need to understand exactly how this pattern works and why it's so resistant to change. Let's talk about the cycle. There's a psychological cycle that keeps people trapped in financial anxiety, and this cycle has very specific phases that repeat constantly, creating a kind of emotional prison from which it seems impossible to escape. The first phase of this cycle is the trigger. Something happens that activates financial anxiety. It could be an unexpected bill that arrives. It could be a conversation about money. It could simply be looking at your bank statement. It could even be seeing someone buying something you'd like to buy but can't. The trigger itself varies from person to person, but what it does is always the same. It activates the brain's alarm system, the primitive part of the mind that was designed to protect us from threats. And when that alarm goes off, the entire body enters a state of alert, The heart speeds up a little, breathing becomes more shallow, muscles get tense, the mind starts firing rapid catastrophic thoughts about the future. Have you felt this? That moment when a simple thought about money makes your entire body change state, as if you just noticed a real and immediate danger? That's the first phase. And what happens next is what really transforms this moment of stress into a long-term, vicious cycle. When you're in this state of alarm, of acute stress caused by financial anxiety, your brain desperately needs to find a way to relieve this unbearable tension. And this is where compensatory behavior comes in, the second phase of the cycle. Compensatory behavior is any action you take not because it actually solves the financial problem, but because it temporarily relieves the emotional discomfort the problem is causing. And what's the most common compensatory behavior when it comes to financial anxiety? Ironically, it's spending money. Seems completely contradictory, doesn't it? The person is stressed because they feel they don't have enough money, and the way they find to relieve that stress is precisely by spending the money they have. But when you understand the psychology behind it, it makes perfect sense. Because spending money, especially on something that gives you immediate pleasure, something you desire, something that seems to improve your life in that moment, releases dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of pleasure, reward, and relief. And when you're drowning in anxiety, your brain is desperate for dopamine, searching for any source of relief it can find. So you buy that piece of clothing you didn't need, you order that food through an app even knowing you're spending more than you should, you sign up for that service that promises to make your life better. You make that little just this once purchase that repeats every week. And the moment you do it, you genuinely feel relief. The anxiety decreases. The tightness in your chest eases. You breathe more calmly. Was the problem solved? No. But the feeling was relieved. And for the primitive brain, which operates in the short term and is just trying to survive the discomfort of the moment, that's enough. But then comes the third phase of the cycle, and this is the cruelest of all: guilt and the reinforcement of anxiety. A few hours later, or the next day, or when the credit card bill arrives, you look at that expense you made and think, why did I do that? You feel guilty, weak, irresponsible, stupid. You promise yourself you won't do it again, that next time you'll have more control, that you need to change. And this guilt, instead of helping you change, actually reinforces the original anxiety. Because now you're not just worried about money, you're worried about money and disappointed in yourself. And when you're in this state of guilt and disappointment, what happens? You become more anxious. And when you become more anxious about money, what happens? Another trigger appears. And when the trigger appears, the cycle starts again. Compensatory spending, temporary relief, guilt, more anxiety, new trigger, new spending, without stopping, without getting anywhere. Out, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And the most disturbing thing about all of this is that the more the cycle repeats, the more automatic it becomes, the more deeply it installs itself in your neurological patterns, to the point where you don't even notice you're in it anymore. It simply is the way you live. Now I want you to think about something very important. If the problem were really a lack of money, earning more money would solve it. But does it? For some people, temporarily maybe. But for most, what happens when income increases is that spending increases in the same proportion, or even faster. There's even a name for this in behavioral economics literature. It's the phenomenon of lifestyle inflation. The person earns more and immediately adjusts their consumption pattern to the new income level. They buy a better car, move to a bigger apartment, start going to more expensive restaurants, switch brands in the clothes they wear, take on new monthly financial commitments they didn't have before. And within a few months, they're at exactly the same level of financial tightness they were before, except now with a higher income. Have you seen this happen? Have you experienced it in your own life? That moment when you finally get the raise you've been waiting for so long, you feel relieved for a few days. And then you realize the bills went up, the expenses increased without you noticing, and the feeling of tightness came back as if it had never left. This happens because the real problem isn't the amount of money coming in. The real problem is the emotional state from which you make decisions about money. And here's a truth that might be difficult to accept, but is absolutely liberating when you truly understand it. As long as you're making financial decisions from a state of fear, anxiety, and chronic stress, it doesn't matter how much money you earn, you're going to stay trapped in the same cycle. Because anxiety is not a problem that gets solved with more money. Anxiety is a problem that gets solved with a change in internal state, with transformation in the way you relate emotionally to the subject of money. And this change, although simple to understand, is not at all easy to accomplish, because it requires you to do something that goes against all your survival instincts. It requires you to stop reacting to fear and start acting from a place of awareness and intention. Let's dive a little deeper into this question of fear, because it really is the central character in this whole story. Financial fear is one of the most primitive and most powerful emotions that exist in the human experience. Because deep down, very deep down, the fear of not having enough money is the fear of not surviving. It's the fear of being without shelter, without food, without security, without access to the basic resources you need to live. And even though rationally you know you're not on the edge of poverty, that you have a job, that you have a roof over your head, that you're not going to starve tomorrow, emotionally, the primitive part of your brain doesn't make that distinction. For the amygdala, which is the fear center in the brain, any threat to your access to resources is interpreted as a threat to survival. And when the brain interprets something as a threat to survival, it doesn't start thinking about long-term solutions, strategic planning, rational decisions. It enters emergency mode, and in emergency mode, there are only 3 possible responses: fight, flight, or freeze. None of these 3 responses is adequate for dealing with complex financial issues, but these are the responses your brain is trying to use when you're dominated by financial anxiety. Fight, in the financial context, usually translates into working more, seeking more sources of income in a compulsive and often disorganized way, trying to control every penny that comes in and goes out with a rigidity that ends up being unsustainable. Flight translates into avoiding looking at the financial situation, not opening the banking app, not checking the credit card bill, postponing conversations about money, procrastinating on important financial decisions. And freeze translates into paralysis, staying stuck in the same pattern because any change seems too big, too scary, too risky. Do you recognize yourself in any of these responses? Have you caught yourself working compulsively to the point of exhaustion, thinking that would solve the money problem? Have you caught yourself running from your own finances, avoiding looking at them because the fear of what you'll find is paralyzing? Have you caught yourself wanting to change, but completely stuck, unable to take the first step because everything seems impossible? What I want you to understand is that these reactions are not character flaws. They're not signs that you're lazy or cowardly or incompetent. They're simply automatic responses from a nervous system that is interpreting the financial situation as a threat and trying to protect you the only way it knows how, through primitive survival reactions. But here's the problem. These reactions that were useful for our ancestors facing real physical threats are completely inadequate for dealing with the financial challenges of the modern world. And as long as you continue operating from them, you'll continue to be trapped in the cycle of financial anxiety, regardless of how much money you earn or how many financial strategies you try to apply. And here comes an especially disturbing part of this whole equation. Chronic financial stress is addictive. That's right, you heard that correctly. Addictive. And I know this might sound absurd at first. Who would choose to be addicted to stress? But it's not a conscious choice. It's a neurological pattern that forms over time. Let me explain how this works. When you're in a state of constant stress, your body is constantly producing cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And cortisol, in acute and temporary doses, is useful. It makes you alert, gives you energy to deal with difficult situations, prepares you for action. The problem is when cortisol becomes chronically elevated, which happens when you live in permanent financial anxiety. And when cortisol is chronically elevated, it creates a state of constant hypervigilance. You're always on alert, always waiting for the next threat, always tense, always worried. And although this is extremely draining and unhappy, your brain starts to adapt to this state. It starts to consider it normal. And here's the really scary part. When you spend a lot of time in a state, the brain starts to feel uncomfortable outside of it. It's the same mechanism that makes people who grew up in chaotic environments have difficulty feeling at peace when things are calm. The brain interpreted chaos as normal and peace as strange and even threatening. So what happens is that some people, after years of living in chronic financial anxiety, unconsciously start to recreate situations of financial stress even when they wouldn't need to. They make decisions that generate more financial pressure. They postpone solving problems until they become urgent. They create financial dramas where there were none. Not because they're masochistic, not because they like to suffer, but because their brain has become dependent on the state of stress, and when that state decreases, the brain interprets it as something wrong and seeks ways to return to what it considers normal. This is absolutely real and is documented in many studies on financial behavior and the psychology of stress. And it's one of the reasons why so many people have difficulty maintaining financial stability even when they temporarily manage to achieve it, because unconsciously they sabotage their own stability to return to the familiar state of anxiety. Can you see any pattern like this in your own life? Moments when things were finally calming down financially and suddenly you made a decision that threw everything back into chaos? Or do you know someone who always seems to create financial problems for themselves, who every time they're almost getting out of the hole finds a way to fall back in? It's not lack of intelligence. It's not lack of information. It's a deeply installed neurological pattern that operates completely below the level of consciousness. And the only way to break this pattern is first to bring it into the light of consciousness, recognize that it exists, understand how it works, observe when it's active, because you can't change what you don't see. And most people never look at this deep layer of their relationship with money. Let's talk now about how all of this affects your ability to make good financial decisions. Because in the end, your financial situation is the accumulated result of hundreds and thousands of decisions you've made over the years. Each purchase, each choice of where to work, each decision about saving or spending, about investing or not investing, about taking on a financial commitment or refusing it, all of this accumulates and creates the financial reality you live in today. And the quality of these decisions depends directly on the emotional state from which you make them. There's an area of research in neuroscience called decision-making under stress, and what the studies consistently show is frightening. When you're in a state of elevated stress, your ability to make rational, long-term decisions is dramatically reduced. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for strategic thinking, long-term planning, rational evaluation of risks and benefits, that part becomes relatively deactivated when stress is high. And the more primitive parts of the brain, those focused on immediate survival and discomfort relief, take control. What this means in practice is that when you're anxious about money, you are literally less capable of making good decisions about money. You become more impulsive, more focused on the short term, more prone to choosing immediate relief instead of future benefit, more susceptible to emotional influences, and less capable of coldly evaluating the available options. It's as if, exactly at the moment when you most need your best judgment capacity, stress takes it away from you. And this creates a devastating cycle. Anxiety leads to bad decisions. Bad decisions lead to worse financial results. Worse financial results lead to more anxiety. More anxiety leads to even worse decisions. And so it goes, in a downward spiral, until the person finds themselves in a financial situation much worse than they ever imagined. Have you ever made an important financial decision while you were very stressed and then deeply regretted it? Have you ever bought something big on impulse when you were emotionally shaken? Have you ever accepted or refused a job opportunity based more on fear than on rational evaluation of the situation? Have you ever entered into a long-term financial commitment, a loan, a contract, a partnership, because you were desperate to solve an immediate problem without properly thinking through the future consequences? If you've done any of these things, and most of us have, you've experienced firsthand how stress destroys the quality of decision-making. And what's most concerning is that when you're living in chronic financial stress, you're making practically all of your financial decisions in this compromised state. It's no wonder the results are so frustrating. So the question that remains is, how do you get out of this? How do you break this cycle that seems so powerful and so automatic? And here, I need to be honest with you. There's no simple answer, there's no magic trick, there's no technique you apply once and that's it. You're free forever. What exists is a process of transformation of your internal relationship with money, of the emotional state from which you operate, of the automatic patterns that govern your financial behavior. And this process starts with something that might seem simple, but is profoundly difficult to do consistently. It starts with awareness. Awareness means stopping operating on autopilot. It means starting to observe your thoughts, your emotions, your impulses in relation to money, not to judge them, not to suppress them, but simply to see them clearly. When you feel that tightness of anxiety about money, instead of immediately reacting to it in the usual way, you pause for a moment and observe. What am I feeling now? Where does this sensation come from? What thoughts are running through my head? What impulse is this feeling generating in me? This simple practice of observation already begins to create a space between stimulus and response, a space where conscious choice becomes possible. Because when you're completely identified with the emotion, when you are the anxiety, there's no choice. There's only automatic reaction. But when you can observe the anxiety as something that's happening inside you but that isn't you, when you can take a step back and see the pattern operating, in that moment you gain the ability to choose a different response. And this conscious observation needs to become a daily practice, a habit cultivated with the same discipline with which you brush your teeth or have breakfast. Because the patterns you're trying to change are deep and old, and they're not going to disappear just because you intellectually understood how they work. They're going to continue trying to express themselves. They're going to continue being activated by the same old triggers. But the more you practice observing them consciously, the more you weaken the automatic power they have over you, and the more you strengthen your ability to consciously choose how to respond. Besides awareness, another fundamental tool in the process of breaking the cycle of financial anxiety is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation doesn't mean suppressing emotions. It doesn't mean pretending you don't feel what you're feeling. It means developing the capacity to be with difficult emotions without being completely dominated by them, without needing to do something immediately to relieve the discomfort they cause. And this is crucial in the financial context, because most destructive behaviors with money happen as attempts to relieve emotional discomfort. When you develop the capacity to tolerate financial anxiety without immediately needing to make a compensatory purchase, without immediately needing to run from the problem, without immediately needing to seek some form of distraction or relief, when you can simply stay with the emotion, breathe through it, allow it to be present without reacting to it, you break the cycle at its most vulnerable point. There are many practices that help develop this capacity for emotional regulation. Conscious breathing practices, meditation, mindfulness, therapy, reflective writing, conscious physical movement, all of these are tools that, when practiced consistently, strengthen your ability to be with difficult emotions without being dragged away by them. And this capacity is one of the most fundamental pillars not just of financial health, but of psychological health as a whole. Because in the end, much of human suffering comes not from difficult emotions themselves, but from our inability to tolerate them and from the compulsion to do anything to escape them, a compulsion that frequently leads us to behaviors that create much more suffering in the long term. Another critical element to breaking the cycle is developing what psychologists call self-compassion. Self-compassion is the ability to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would treat a good friend who is going through difficulties. And this is especially important in the context of financial anxiety, because one of the things that most feeds the cycle is the brutal self-criticism that most people direct at themselves when they make financial mistakes. When you spend more than you should, when you make a bad financial decision, when you break a promise you made to yourself about money, what's your internal reaction? For most people, it's a flood of self-criticism. I'm an idiot. I'll never learn. I have no control. I'm a failure. I don't deserve to have a better financial life. And this self-criticism, far from motivating positive change, actually reinforces the cycle. Because it increases anxiety, increases stress, decreases self-efficacy, the belief that you're capable of changing, and makes it more likely that you'll fall back into compensatory behavior. Self-compassion doesn't mean being complacent with destructive behaviors. It means recognizing that you're human, that humans make mistakes, that you're doing the best you can with the emotional and psychological resources you have available at this moment. It means understanding that the patterns you're trying to change were installed over years and aren't going to disappear overnight. It means treating your financial mistakes not as evidence that you're fundamentally flawed, but as information about where you still need to grow and learn. And interestingly, research shows that people who practice self-compassion have much more success in changing problematic behaviors than people who use self-criticism as a motivational strategy. Because self-compassion creates psychological safety, and when you feel safe, you can look honestly at your problems without needing to run from or defend against them. Let's also talk about the importance of questioning the narratives you carry about money. Because everyone has stories they tell themselves about money, about why the situation is the way it is, about why it's difficult to change, about what's possible and what's not possible. And many of these narratives were absorbed without questioning from the environment you grew up in, from the experiences you had, from cultural messages about money that are everywhere. Narratives like, money doesn't grow on trees, rich people are greedy, normal people like me will never have financial security, I'm terrible with money, I've always been this way and always will be. These are stories, they're not objective truths. But when you accept them as truths, they become self-fulfilling prophecies. They shape your perception, influence your decisions, limit what you consider possible for yourself. Questioning these narratives doesn't mean replacing them with superficial positive thinking or empty affirmations. It means honestly examining whether they're true, where they came from, what evidence exists for and against them, and whether they're helping you or hurting you. And when you identify a narrative that's limiting you, you can consciously choose a different narrative, one that's more accurate and more useful. Not a comfortable lie, but a more complete truth. For example, instead of, I'm terrible with money, maybe the more complete truth is, I never learned good financial practices and developed some problematic patterns, but I'm capable of learning and changing if I commit to it. That second narrative is more truthful and infinitely more useful than the first. Another fundamental piece of the puzzle is developing what we call discomfort tolerance, because changing any deeply installed pattern is uncomfortable. Breaking the cycle of financial anxiety is going to require you to do different things, to make different decisions, to resist impulses that you used to follow automatically. And all of this is going to generate discomfort. It's going to generate that feeling of doing something wrong, even when rationally you know you're doing something right. It's going to generate temporarily higher anxiety while you're in the process of change. It's going to generate the sensation that you're swimming against the current of your own habits. And if you haven't developed some capacity to tolerate this discomfort, you're going to give up halfway and go back to the old pattern because at least it's familiar. Discomfort tolerance develops gradually through small, consistent practices. Every time you feel an impulse to make a compensatory purchase and manage to resist it for a few minutes, you're strengthening that capacity. Every time you feel anxiety about money and manage to stay with it without running away, you're strengthening that capacity. Every time you make a different financial decision than the usual one, even while feeling uncomfortable, you're strengthening that capacity. It's like a muscle that gets stronger with use. And the stronger that muscle gets, the more capable you become of making the necessary changes to break the cycle of financial anxiety. It's also important to recognize that often the cycle of financial anxiety is intertwined with other, broader emotional and psychological patterns. For some people, financial anxiety is part of a general pattern of anxiety that manifests in various areas of life. For others, it's connected to issues of self-esteem, personal worth, fear of abandonment or rejection. For still others, it's linked to past traumas, to experiences of deprivation, to destructive messages they received about money in childhood. And when this is the case, working only at the behavioral level, trying to force changes in financial habits without addressing the deeper emotional issues, has limited success, because you're trying to treat the symptom without dealing with the root. If you suspect that your financial anxiety is connected to deeper emotional issues, it can be extremely useful to seek professional support. A therapist with experience in financial issues can help you explore these connections, process past experiences that are still influencing the present, develop the emotional skills necessary for a healthier relationship with money. And there's absolutely nothing wrong or weak about seeking this kind of help. In fact, recognizing that you need support and seeking it out is a sign of strength and wisdom, not weakness. Let's also talk about the role of environment and social relationships in this equation. Because you don't exist in a vacuum. You're constantly being influenced by the people around you, by the social norms of your group, by the consumer culture you're embedded in. And if the environment around you reinforces patterns of financial anxiety and compensatory spending, it's going to be much harder to change, even if you're working hard on your internal process. For example, if all the people you spend time with have the habit of dealing with stress through shopping, of expressing care through expensive gifts, of measuring success through material possessions, you're going to constantly be pushed back to these same patterns, even if part of you wants to do differently. Sometimes, changing your relationship with money also requires making changes in your social relationships. Not necessarily cutting people out of your life, but perhaps establishing clearer boundaries, seeking new social circles that have values more aligned with where you want to go, having honest conversations with people close to you about the changes you're trying to make, and asking for their support. And this can be uncomfortable. It can generate conflict. It can make you feel different or even judged. But if the social environment is actively sabotaging your attempt to change, something needs to change in that dynamic. It's also worth thinking about the physical and digital environment you've created around yourself. What kind of financial stimuli are you constantly receiving? Are you exposed to advertising all the time? Do you have shopping apps installed on your phone that make impulsive spending way too easy? Do you follow people on social media who are always displaying consumption and creating in you the feeling that something's missing? Do you watch programs that normalize debt and excessive spending? Each of these small elements of the environment contributes to maintaining or breaking the cycle of financial anxiety. And making intentional changes in the environment, uninstalling problematic apps, limiting exposure to advertising, curating the content you consume, can significantly reduce the triggers that set off the cycle. One point that cannot be ignored is the issue of practical financial education. Because although I've focused heavily in this video on the emotional and psychological aspects of financial anxiety, and these aspects are really fundamental, it's also true that many people simply never learned basic financial skills. No one ever taught them how to make a budget that works, how to plan financially for medium and long-term goals, how to evaluate whether a debt makes sense or not, how to invest in a way that's appropriate to their own profile, how to negotiate salary, how to make important financial decisions in a structured way. And the lack of these practical skills contributes to anxiety, because you feel lost without control, without knowing what to do. So part of the process of breaking the cycle also involves seeking practical financial education. And there are many resources available today: books, courses, podcasts, videos, spreadsheets, educational apps. The important thing is to seek reliable sources based on solid principles, not on miraculous promises or dubious schemes. And to apply what you learn gradually, experimenting, adjusting to what works for you without expectation of perfection. Because there's no one right way to manage money that works for everyone. There are general principles that are important, but the application of them needs to be personalized to your reality, your values, your goals. And here's an important truth: you don't need to be perfect with money to have a financial life much better than you have today. You don't need to never make another financial mistake, never spend on something that wasn't in the budget, never feel anxiety about money again. That would be unrealistic and unattainable. What you need is to reduce the frequency and intensity of destructive patterns. You need to increase your awareness of what you're doing and why. You need to develop the capacity to course correct when you notice you're veering off instead of entering a spiral of loss of control. You need to build emotional resilience to deal with the ups and downs of financial life without being completely destabilized by them. And all of this is completely possible, even if it seems distant right now. The transformation of your relationship with money is not an event. It's a process that has advances and setbacks, victories and failures, moments of clarity and moments of confusion. And that's normal. That's part of real growth. The important thing is to stay in the process, to keep practicing awareness, to keep strengthening emotional regulation, to keep questioning limiting narratives, to keep learning practical skills, to keep seeking support when you need it. And gradually, almost imperceptibly day to day, but clearly when you look back after months and years, things change. Patterns lose their strength, decisions get better, anxiety decreases, and the feeling of being in control of your financial life, not in a rigid and controlling way, but in a conscious and intentional way, grows. And here's something I want you to understand deeply. You deserve to have a healthy relationship with money. You deserve to feel peace about your finances. You deserve to make conscious decisions that are aligned with what you truly want for your life, not with automatic fears installed decades ago. You deserve to get out of the cycle of financial anxiety that has consumed so much energy, so much time, so much mental space that could be used for things that truly matter to you. And although the path to get there requires effort, requires courage, requires willingness to look at uncomfortable things and change deeply rooted patterns, that path exists. It's real. And thousands of people have walked it before you and arrived on the other side. You can too. The question that remains is, are you willing to start? Not to start tomorrow with a perfect, fully developed plan, but to start today, right now, with one small step in the direction of awareness. With the decision to observe your next reaction of financial anxiety instead of simply being dragged by it. With the choice to question the next limiting narrative that appears in your mind. With the courage to stay with an emotional discomfort for a few minutes instead of immediately running to relieve it through compensatory spending. With the humility to recognize that you need help and seek resources, whether books, courses, therapy, honest conversations with trusted people. Starting is everything, because as long as you don't start, nothing changes. And each day that passes without change is one more day living in the cycle you already know and that you already know isn't working. So the final invitation I make to you is this. Choose one thing, just one, that you learned in this video that resonated with you. Something that made you think, yes, that makes sense, that applies to me. And in the coming days, pay attention specifically to that. Observe when that pattern appears in your life. Observe how it operates. Observe what impact it has. And when you catch yourself in the middle of it, see if you can pause, even if just for 1 second, and consciously choose a different response. It doesn't need to be a dramatic change. It can be tiny, but it needs to be conscious. Because it's from these small, conscious choices, repeated day after day, that real and lasting transformation is born. And your financial life and your peace of mind deserve that transformation. See you in the next video.